You want to count saints, Ethan? A long-form reply to saint counting, infernalist moral formation, rival traditions of compassion, and the people who made suffering harder to find. All right, so bring the calendar, the martyrology, the doctors, the mystics, the confessors, the martyrs, the friars, the abbots, the whole celestial bureaucracy. Bring an abacus if the incense makes the arithmetic difficult. Your claim is about a majority of Catholic saints and holy men. That was the claim from the beginning. I am going to answer that claim exactly as stated. No cheap unanimity straw man. No imaginary retreat. Let the majority be as large as you please. Suppose 70% of the relevant Catholic saints accepted eternal hell. Suppose 90% did. Suppose the number is so overwhelming that the dissenters can hold their annual meeting in a broom closet. Wonderful. We have learned something about Catholic history. We have not yet learned that eternal torment is morally acceptable. A majority is a fact about a population. Moral authority is a conclusion. Between the two sits an argument, and the argument is where the furniture begins to disappear. The saints were formed inside a church. They read its scriptures, heard its sermons, learned its prayers, feared its punishments, absorbed its pictures of sin, practiced its sacraments, revered its authorities, and often regarded submission to that inherited order as a virtue. The Church then selects exemplary members of that world and says, in effect, behold, the exemplary members of our world tend to judge as our world taught them to judge. This is supposed to astonish me. A whiskey club could discover, after a solemn investigation, that a majority of its honored members approve of whiskey. A military academy might find an alarming concentration of people who esteem military discipline. Benedictine monasteries have produced a suspicious number of men favorably disposed toward monasticism. None of these discoveries requires a miracle. Catholic formation produces Catholic judgments. The saints may be brilliant. They may be courageous. They may be self-sacrificing. They may have fed the poor and nursed the sick and prayed until their knees objected. None of those virtues turns a culturally transmitted judgment about endless punishment into an independent measurement of moral reality. A halo is an honorific. It is not a likelihood ratio. And since Ethan wants the saints entered into evidence, I propose that we commit the indecency of actually reading them. The Census of Heaven. The majority claim granted at full strength. Let us give Ethan the useful premise. Most Catholic saints and holy men accepted some traditional infernalist picture, final loss, endless punishment, eternal fire, irreversible damnation, or a moral order in which some creatures remain forever excluded from beatitude. Fine. Put the premise in bold. Engrave it on marble. I do not need to dispute it. The question is what follows. The philosophy of disagreement is less impressed by headcounts than popular apologetics tends to be. Testimony gains evidential force through competence, access, independence, reliability, and the absence of obvious common causes. 34. Collective judgment theory makes the same elementary nuisance of itself. Correlated votes do not behave like independent votes. If one source of error influences the whole electorate, adding voters can multiply confidence without multiplying information. 35. Catholic saints are about as independent from Catholic moral formation as cardinals are independent from Catholic ecclesiology. The observation is not an insult. It is a description of where the sample came from. The Church itself explains canonization as an ecclesial investigation of heroic Christian virtue, including faith, hope, and charity. 36. The population therefore arrives already filtered through a Catholic conception of Christian excellence. That is perfectly appropriate for canonization. It is hopelessly awkward if somebody later tries to use the canonized population as though it were a random jury convened to test Catholic moral intuitions. Picture the machinery. A tradition announces that certain doctrines are revealed. It forms believers inside those doctrines. It praises those who live heroically within that theological world. It canonizes some of them. Centuries later, an apologist points to the resulting convergence and says, "You see, our holy people agree with our theology." One could hardly design a better instrument for discovering what the tradition taught. One could hardly design a worse instrument for discovering whether the tradition was right merely because its graduates agreed with it. The circle is so round it deserves its own feast day. What sanctity can establish? A saint's life may be evidence of courage. Damien of Molokai is evidence that a man can walk toward a quarantined community when every selfish impulse tells him to walk away. 12. Vincent de Paul is evidence that institutional charity can be built and maintained. 13. Camillus de Lellis is evidence that care for the sick can become the organizing principle of a life. 14. Those facts travel well. A Buddhist can see the courage, a Jain can see it, an atheist can see it, a Muslim can see it. The wound was dressed, the hungry person was fed, the abandoned patient received care. Nobody must first accept transubstantiation before the bandage becomes visible. Now change the proposition. Ask whether an infinitely good God may sustain, authorize, or ratify endless conscious misery as deserved punishment. Suddenly, the saint's courage in a hospital does not settle the issue. The man who is exquisitely compassionate toward a fever may still inherit a disastrously distorted theory of punishment. Human beings are perfectly capable of compartmentalized moral excellence. History has provided enough examples to fill several libraries and a few prisons. Great musicians have held stupid political views. Great mathematicians have believed nonsense outside mathematics. Generous parents have defended cruel institutions. Courage in one domain does not issue a passport to infallibility in another. The title saint cannot disinfect a premise. The common cause problem. Suppose 1,000 judges independently inspect a machine, and 900 report the same defect. That convergence should impress us. Now suppose 900 judges copied the same manual, studied under the same instructor, and were told before inspection that doubting the defect would endanger their souls. The number 900 has not changed. Its evidential meaning has. That is the difficulty here. Scripture supplies images of fire, exclusion, judgment, worms, darkness, destruction, and punishment. Tradition supplies authoritative interpretations. Preachers supply terror. Devotional literature teaches believers to imagine their own sins as meriting hell. Confession forms a vocabulary of guilt. Hagiography rewards submission. The saint does not meet the doctrine as a stranger. Then the resulting agreement is cited against the moral intuition that endless suffering is monstrous. This procedure has the elegance of a man teaching his parrot a sentence and then calling the parrot as an independent witness. Ethan may keep every saint in his majority. He still owes the causal story. Why think the convergence arose from unusually reliable moral perception rather than unusually powerful common formation? How much weight should the vote receive after the common causes are placed back into the picture? 34, 35, 36. Until those questions are answered, the head count is denominational sociology wearing a judge's wig. Open the ledger. The ancient and patristic infernalists. Now let us inspect the actual votes. No gauze, no pious perfume. Let the texts speak in the ordinary language in which their readers encountered them. Justin Martyr. His first apology says the wicked who do not repent are punished in everlasting fire. The second apology speaks of sinners justly suffering in eternal fire. 41:53. Here is an early saint and martyr, entered cleanly in the infernalist column, Cyril of Jerusalem. In his catechetical teaching on the resurrection, the wicked rise to a condition fitted for punishment, with fire and punishment stretching into eternity. 54. Another saint, another ancient bishop, another vote, Athanasius. A USCCB ecumenical document quotes the traditional Athanasian contrast. Those who have done good go into eternal life. Those who have done evil into eternal fire. 44. The saint who became a symbol of Nicene orthodoxy does not rescue Ethan from the moral problem. He enlarges the sample. John Chrysostom. In Homily 25 on Romans, the reasoning is wonderfully uncomplicated. If the life is eternal, the punishment is eternal. 42. There is a certain relief in reading a theologian who does not hide the corpse under 6 adverbs. Jerome, writing of the dead, he speaks of Gehenna and the eternal fire burning for punishment. 43. Saint, doctor, biblical scholar, infernalist vote duly counted. Augustine then arrives with the confidence of a man who knows he will be quoted for 15 centuries. Book 21 of City of God insists that eternal punishment has no end. His symmetry is explicit. If eternal life means endless life, eternal punishment means endless punishment. 8. But Augustine gives us something better than mere duration. He tells us what happens to the merciful impulse that objects. He describes the opposing tendency as proceeding from a greater tenderness of spirit. Greater tenderness. Augustine sees the softer heart, names it accurately, and then tells it to lose the case. That sentence is worth more than 100 modern euphemisms. The humane recoil is already present. The doctrine does not discover compassion. It overrules compassion. Centuries later, an apologist points to the saints who learned to perform that overruling and asks us to distrust the recoil because the saints distrusted it. The factory stamps its own certificate of inspection. Augustine is one of the most brilliant minds in Christian history. He was also capable of being horribly wrong. Genius does not become less genius when it makes a moral disaster more articulate. Sometimes the danger increases. A fool can only offer you a bad conclusion. A genius can build it a cathedral. Gregory the Great follows. His pastoral rule speaks of liability to eternal punishment and grievous torments. The Moralia in Job defends punishment without end and describes the just as beholding the eternal punishments they escaped. 45:51. We are accumulating saints. We are also accumulating evidence that sanctity and infernalism can live together very comfortably. That fact proves compatibility. It does not prove innocence. Scholastic polish and the disappearance of pity. Anselm belongs in the genealogy, even though he should not be lazily counted as a canonized Catholic saint. Cur Deus Homo 121 gives us the exchange rate that makes later infernalist arithmetic easier to swallow. Boso says he ought not perform the smallest act against God's will, even to preserve the whole creation. Anselm increases the thought experiment to infinitely many worlds. Once divine offense is assigned a value that outweighs any finite or even indefinitely multiplied creaturely welfare, the verdict has been written before the victims enter the courtroom. One glance against the divine will may outweigh worlds. Very well. Once one accepts that bookkeeping, the screams have already lost on accounting grounds. Then comes Aquinas. The relevant material appears in the supplement to the Summa, a posthumous compilation drawing from Aquinas' earlier Sentences commentary. 10. That textual history matters for attribution. It does not rescue the moral picture because the doctrine remains Aquinas' own scholastic material and has been transmitted under his authority. Question 94 asks about the relation of the blessed to the damned. The blessed see the sufferings of the damned so that their own happiness may be more delightful by comparison. They do not pity the damned in a way that wishes the misery to cease, because such a wish would conflict with divine justice. They rejoice in the punishment under the aspect of justice and their own deliverance. 11. There are moments when scholastic precision resembles a jeweler setting a diamond into a rat trap, indirectly, under the aspect of justice. By comparison, fine. The damned still suffer forever. The perfected saint still cannot rationally wish the suffering to stop. The sight of the misery still contributes to the appreciation of beatitude. The adverbs have been polished. The gallows remains upright. Suppose a modern philosopher announced that moral perfection consists partly in losing pity for people undergoing endless agony because their agony is deserved. Nobody would call the theory humane. Put the same sentence in Latin, place it under a halo, and suddenly we are asked to distrust our disgust. No. The disgust has earned its day in court. If your theory of beatitude requires the best human heart to become incapable of wishing an endless misery to end, then the defect may be in the theory rather than in the heart. Bonaventure, Bernard, Bellarmine, and a host of later scholastic and devotional authorities inhabit the same broad, infernalist civilization. I do not need to stuff the ballot box with every ambiguous phrase they wrote. Ethan already has his majority. The problem begins after he wins it. Mystics, doctors, and the devotional nervous system. Catherine of Siena makes the matter domestic. Her dialogue presents blessed parents as seeing a child in hell without being troubled and as remaining content with the divine punishment. 46. There are abstractions one can hide inside the word justice. A parent and a child make hiding more difficult. If a mother's love must be cured until she can behold her child's endless ruin without sorrow, one might wonder whether heaven has perfected the mother or merely completed the anesthesia. The theory answers, divine justice is loved perfectly. The ordinary conscience answers, you have defined perfection until pity became a disease. Teresa of Avila describes a vision of the hell she believed her sins deserved. 47. The point here concerns formation. Infernalism does not remain in the catechism like a dead beetle under glass. It enters the imagination. It teaches a devout person to interpret herself through a penal grammar in which finite human failures can make everlasting torment intelligible as desert. Alphonsus Liguori writes similarly of having merited hell for sin and of suffering now in relation to being spared eternally. 48. Ethan has appealed to saints such as Alphonsus and Padre Pio as counters to modern moral revulsion. 2. Francis de Sales, another saint and doctor, includes a meditation on hell in the introduction to The Devout Life, instructing the reader to contemplate the loss, torments, and eternity of the damned. 55. Infernalism here is spiritual exercise. The believer rehearses it until the impossible becomes familiar, and the familiar begins to masquerade as obvious. Leonard of Port Morris preached the notorious sermon usually titled, The Little Number of Those Who Are Saved, an exercise in the fewness of salvation and the seriousness of eternal loss. 57. He was canonized. The sermon has circulated for generations precisely because Catholic devotional culture found such terror spiritually useful. Faustina Kowalska's diary reports a vision of hell and depicts its sufferings as everlasting. 56. Private revelation is not dogma. Nobody needs to pretend otherwise. The evidential point is cultural. A canonized mystic could inhabit an imaginative world in which eternal torment appears as a dreadful reality, demanding assent and warning, rather than as a moral reductio against the theology itself. Count these examples exactly as Ethan wants them counted. I am not trying to make the infernalist majority smaller. I am making it visible. Athanasius, Cyril, Chrysostom, Jerome, Augustine, Gregory the Great, Aquinas, Catherine, Teresa, Francis de Sales, Alphonsus, Leonard, Faustina, Ad Justin, Add the many others whose traditional theology assumed final irreversible loss. The majority is not being denied. The majority is being cross-examined. The Catholic minority that ruins the mystique. Now for the minority. Gregory of Nyssa, Catholic saint, Cappadocian father, major theologian. The Great Catechism presents post-mortem fire in purgative terms and speaks of nature restored pure to God. On the soul and the resurrection places the removal of evil within a restorative horizon. 3, 38, 39. Gregory does not need 51% of the vote. He needs only to exist. If sanctity were a reliable spiritual metal detector for the moral necessity of everlasting punishment, Gregory's detector appears to have been defective in a remarkably interesting direction. It detected restoration. Macrina the Younger deepens the embarrassment. Gregory presents her as the teacher in On the Soul and the Resurrection, and the Old Catholic Encyclopedia describes the dialogue as treating the restoration of all things. 40. One saintly Christian imagination moves toward cosmic restoration. Another saintly Christian imagination can picture blessed parents content with a child in hell. The title saint has failed to adjudicate the dispute. It has merely decorated both sides. Isaac of Nineveh makes the point almost comically difficult to evade. Pope Francis announced his addition to the Roman Martyrology in November 2024. The Vatican published the Act, and recent Cambridge scholarship describes Isaac's corpus as containing an ardent defense of universal salvation. 456. Rome's own martyrological ledger now contains a saint whose theology supplies precisely the sort of universalist counterexample a saint-counting argument would prefer not to meet at dinner. Gregory, Macrina, Isaac. 3 is not a majority. I am delighted to save Ethan the trouble of shouting this across the internet. They do not need to be a majority. They establish a different proposition. Holiness, ascetic seriousness, prayer, theological intelligence, and ecclesial veneration did not mechanically produce infernalism. The machinery admitted other moral visions. I will not pad this list with every disputed universalist candidate. Maximus the Confessor has been read in universalist directions by some scholars and resisted by others. Various fathers contain restorationist passages that can be debated until the second coming. Stuffing uncertain names into the ballot box would only make the argument look nervous. 3 clean counterexamples are enough to destroy the superstition that sainthood itself points the conscience toward eternal torment. Ethan can win the census. He still has to win the philosophy. Catholic saints whose greatness came from reducing suffering. There is another Catholic ledger, and it is a better one. Damien of Molokai went to people with Hansen's disease who had been quarantined and abandoned. He remained, worked, organized, ministered, built, buried, cared, became ill, and died there. 12. Vincent de Paul built networks of practical charity. 13. Camillus de Lellis made care for the sick into a religious vocation. 14. These saints are morally intelligible before theology begins its explanation. A sick person needed care. They supplied care. A poor person was abandoned. They organized help. A corpse needed burial. Somebody carried it. Here, sainthood becomes persuasive because the evidence runs through the sufferer rather than around him. The moral greatness does not depend upon an argument that misery is secretly good, deserved forever, metaphysically secondary, or part of an invisible balance sheet. The greatness appears in the opposite motion. Pain exists, therefore move toward it and reduce it. When Catholicism produces that kind of sanctity, I have no difficulty admiring it. The admiration becomes weaker exactly where theology asks compassion to reverse direction and call endless misery just. Holy people outside Rome. The away team is allowed onto the field. Ethan has also appealed publicly to the common practice of the saints in a discussion of animal welfare and meat consumption, describing animal welfare interests as comparatively morally insignificant and defending the permissibility of inflicting animal suffering for ordinary meat consumption. 37. Splendid. The method is officially in evidence. Holy practice is supposed to discipline our moral judgment about suffering. Then the comparison cannot stop at the border of Catholicism unless the conclusion was packed into the suitcase before the journey began. If rival holy people are excluded because they are not Catholic, the argument becomes invincible in the way a home team becomes invincible after banning all visitors from the stadium. So let us invite the visitors. Mahavira and the Jain Revolution in Moral Attention. Jain ethics treats ahimsa with a severity that makes most Western moral scruple look half awake. The Stanford Encyclopedia and Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy describe nonviolence as a central Jain discipline extending far beyond human beings. 1516. A Stanford-hosted account emphasizes respect and compassion toward animals, plants, and humans within the Jain moral universe. 50. The historical and metaphysical apparatus of Jainism is its own subject. I am interested in the moral training. Here, the ascetic does not begin with the question, how little weight may I assign this creature's suffering before dinner becomes inconvenient? He begins with the possibility that his appetite may be the morally suspicious party. Mahavira's tradition pushes moral attention downward and outward toward insects, animals, small lives, unnoticed lives, lives that possess no vote and leave no theology behind. Compare the direction of formation. One discipline can teach a believer to regard some suffering as negligible because the victim is an animal. Another trains the believer to treat harm itself as spiritually dangerous and to reorganize ordinary life around avoiding it. If holy practice is evidence, then the Jain witness does not politely wait outside while Catholic witnesses finish testifying. It sits down and asks why the moral microscope seems clearer in the supposedly pagan laboratory. The Buddha, loving kindness, and the refusal to shrink the circle. The Metta Sutta extends wishes for safety and happiness across living beings without leaving a convenient class outside the circle. 17. No doctrine of eternal retribution is required to understand the moral gesture. The mind is trained to widen concern. One may reject Buddhist metaphysics and still recognize the direction of the exercise. More beings noticed, more suffering taken seriously, fewer excuses for indifference. The comparison with infernalism is almost embarrassingly simple. When a tradition confronts misery, what does spiritual perfection do to compassion? Does it enlarge compassion until no suffering creature becomes invisible? Or does it perfect the believer until certain sufferers can be contemplated without pity because justice has classified them correctly? A clever theologian can build distinctions around the second answer for hours. The sufferer will remain where he was when the lecture began. Shantideva. Become the medicine and stay. Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara is one of the great documents of Mahayana moral aspiration. He wishes to become doctor, medicine, nurse, food, drink, and every useful thing for suffering beings until their afflictions are relieved. 18:19. There is a line of moral imagination here so direct that commentary almost insults it. Be useful to the sufferer. Become what relieves the suffering. If somebody is hungry, become food. If somebody is ill, become medicine. If somebody is abandoned, become the person who stays. And then Shantideva goes further. Near the end of the Bodhicharyavatara, he prays that, for as long as space endures and living beings remain, he too may remain in order to dispel the misery of the world. 65. That is not a decorative flourish about being nice. It is the moral imagination of a man volunteering to stay where suffering remains, instead of treating his own final release as the first item on the agenda. The line is almost indecently simple. If beings are still here suffering, then I am still here too. Place that beside a theology where the blessed lose pity for the damned because the damned deserve what they receive. 11. One imagination asks how to become medicine. The other asks how pity can be corrected until it stops objecting. If Ethan wants to tell me the second group has superior moral perception because more Catholic saints inhabit it, he is free to try. He should bring a very long explanation and perhaps a shorter word than compassion. Avalokiteshvara. The shepherd goes last. Tibetan Buddhist tradition even has a name for the ideal Ethan's saint-counting argument would rather not meet in a dark alley, shepherd-like bodhicitta. The shepherd drives the flock to safety and comes behind. In the standard explanation, one resolves to bring every other sentient being to Buddhahood first, and to attain it oneself only afterward. 66. Avalokiteshvara, the great bodhisattva of compassion, is presented in precisely this form. In the traditional account of his bodhisattva vow, he refuses to realize enlightenment until he has first led all mother sentient beings there. 67. There is no need to embroider the contrast. One holy ideal says, everybody else first, I go last. The infernalist ideal says, some may be lost forever, and perfected love must finally cease objecting to it. If we are counting holy people as evidence of moral perception, Ethan does not get to count only the saints whose moral imaginations were trained inside his own fence, and then act surprised when the fence wins. Ksitigarbha, heaven can wait. Ksitigarbha supplies the comparison in the cruelest possible form for the infernalist argument. East Asian Buddhist devotion celebrates the bodhisattva vow not to attain Buddhahood while the hells remain populated with beings needing deliverance. 49. Read the moral architecture. Hell has occupants, therefore bliss can wait. Now read Aquinas' architecture. Hell has occupants. The blessed cannot rightly wish their punishment to cease. Their own beatitude becomes more delightful by contrast. 11. I do not need to prove Buddhism true to compare these moral pictures. I can reject rebirth, karma, bodhisattva cosmology, every metaphysical brick in the building, and still notice which room contains more mercy. One ideal refuses consummation while hell remains inhabited. The other ideal consummates heaven partly by eliminating the pity that would protest hell. A headcount of Catholic saints cannot make that contrast disappear. It can only tell us which picture Catholic formation more often produced. Patrul Rinpoche and Atisha remain for even one being. The same moral nerve appears in named Buddhist masters, not only in legendary bodhisattvas. Patrul Rinpoche, the 19th century Tibetan teacher, preserves a vow whose point is almost impossible to soften. As long as any sentient being anywhere has not been liberated, may I remain for that being, even if I have already attained unsurpassed enlightenment. 68. Atisha's 11th century lamp for the path gives the aspirant an equally merciless sentence. Take no joy in swiftly attaining enlightenment for yourself. Remain until the very end for the sake of even a single being. 69. One being, not a majority, not the deserving, not the doctrinally convenient. One being is enough to postpone the celebration. This is what makes the comparison hurt. The moral imagination being praised is not, I shall be happy once justice has classified the sufferers correctly. It is, if one sufferer is still outside, I am not finished. Ramanuja, the hagiographic knife. Hindu traditions contain their own saints, teachers, and devotional heroes, and one story about Ramanuja is almost too well designed for this debate. The traditional hagiography tells that Ramanuja received a sacred saving mantra under a command not to disclose it, He was warned that revealing it would bring damnation upon him. According to the story, he climbed to a public place and proclaimed the mantra so that others might receive liberation. When challenged, he answered in substance that if he alone went to hell while many others were saved, the bargain was worth it. 58. This is hagiography, not CCTV footage from the 11th century. Its historical details should be treated as hagiographical tradition. Its moral ideal is perfectly clear. The saint is admirable because he is willing to lose himself rather than monopolize salvation. Put that beside the infernalist heaven in which perfected saints cannot wish the damned released. Ramanuja's traditional saintly image says, "If my damnation purchases their liberation, let me be damned." Aquinas's blessed say, "If their damnation is just, pity must not wish it away." 11. I know which sentence I would trust near a suffering creature. Ethan can answer that Ramanuja's theology is false. Perhaps. That answer misses the point. The saint-counting argument invokes moral formation and holy character as evidence. Ramanuja's hagiographic tradition has just entered an exhibit of holy character that points in precisely the opposite direction. The away team has scored. Declaring its metaphysics invalid after the goal does not erase the moral comparison. Sikh service. Equality with sleeves rolled up. Guru Nanak's Sikh legacy gives the argument a kitchen. Langar makes equality edible. People sit, cook, serve, clean, and eat across distinctions of caste and status. 20. A doctrine that becomes a meal has an advantage over a doctrine that becomes a seminar about why somebody may suffer forever. Sikh tradition also remembers Bhai Kanhaiya serving water to wounded soldiers without regard to which side they fought on. 59. His critics complained that he aided the enemy. The remembered moral reply treats the wounded as human beings before treating them as factions. That is a religious imagination worth placing beside saint counting. The victim appears first. The label appears later. A thirsty enemy still gets water. The moral world is not impoverished because Rome did not canonize the man. Valalar. Compassion as a religious test. Valalar, Ramalinga Swamigal, made Jivakarunyam, compassion toward living beings, central to spiritual life and institutionalized feeding the hungry. Sources associated with his Dharma Salai emphasize feeding without narrow social exclusion and connect spiritual life with non-killing and compassion toward creatures. 21. Again, the direction matters. Religious seriousness enlarges the range of suffering one notices. Hunger becomes a sacred emergency. Animal suffering becomes morally visible. Compassion is tested by what one does for the being in front of oneself. No one needs to accept Valalar's entire theology to understand why this counts as a morally impressive spiritual formation. What the rival saints actually prove. Mahavira's tradition, the Buddha's loving kindness, Shantideva's wish to become medicine, Ksitagarbha's refusal of final bliss while hell remains occupied, Ramanuja's willingness in hagiography to risk damnation for the salvation of others, Sikh Langar, Bhai Kanhaiya's water, Valalar's feeding of the hungry. These do not prove Jainism, Buddhism, Hinduism, or Sikhism true. That is exactly the point. Holy character is cheap as a sectarian truth detector because rival traditions produce holy character. If the Catholic says, "Our saints count because Catholicism is true," then saint counting is doing no evidential work. Catholic truth is simply being assumed. If the Catholic says, "Our saints count because holy people have superior moral perception," then rival holy people enter the evidence and the courtroom becomes crowded immediately. And once the courtroom is crowded, the moral visions conflict. Some holy people train themselves to accept endless punishment. Some holy people train themselves to empty hell. Some holy people learn that animals scarcely matter beside human goods. Some organize their lives around avoiding harm to insects. Some learn to call themselves deserving of eternal punishment. Some are celebrated for risking their own damnation rather than hoarding salvation. The word holy does not resolve the conflict. It names the people having it. Now, it is true that even in the Eastern traditions, Naraka, hell, is very painful. It is considered a torture/torment. But notice that this torture/torment is at the very least temporary. The purpose of the examples in these traditions was to show how saints in Eastern religions were significantly more compassionate than the Catholic saints that Ethan loves. When compassion touches the world. A vulgar standard. What happened to the suffering? Now I propose a rude change of subject. Leave relics, visions, mystical ranks, canonization files, robes, titles, and denominational prestige on the table for a moment. Ask what happened to the suffering. Did the patient live? Did the infection rate fall? Did the child avoid paralysis? Did fewer mothers die after childbirth? Did a contaminated water source get identified? Did surgery become less lethal? Did malaria become treatable? Did smallpox disappear from the planet? Did a regulator prevent a dangerous drug from reaching millions of pregnant patients? This standard is vulgar because reality can answer it. It is also imperfect. Excellent. An imperfect measure that can be inspected, corrected, criticized, and improved has a dignity unavailable to prestige that asks for deference before measurement begins. The history of public health and medicine contains egos, mistakes, exploitation, injustice, bad trials, false starts, manufacturing disasters, colonial structures, and plenty of human vanity. Good. Put all of it on the record. Evidence earns trust by surviving the publication of its embarrassments. Hagiography tends to polish the halo. Science, at its best, publishes the adverse event. Florence Nightingale. Pity armed with arithmetic. Florence Nightingale is a fitting beginning because compassion alone did not satisfy her. She wanted mortality to become legible. Historical and medical scholarship emphasizes her work on sanitation, hospital administration, reform, and statistical presentation. 22-23. The sentimental portrait gives us the lamp. The formidable portrait gives us the table of deaths. She cared enough about suffering to count it, classify it, compare it, and argue with institutions that preferred not to be embarrassed by it. There is moral beauty in accurate mortality statistics. Every corrected column refuses to let a corpse disappear into rhetoric. The Crimean War story has complications. Attribution is shared. Sanitary reforms were collective. The famous decline in mortality cannot honestly be reduced to one woman walking through wards with a lamp. 22-23. That complication does not weaken the moral point. It strengthens it. A legend needs simplicity. An evidence-based achievement can afford collaborators, revisions, ugly data, and footnotes. John Snow and the pump handle. John Snow's cholera investigations belong in the same ledger. In the 1854 Broad Street outbreak, he mapped cases, examined patterns, and argued that contaminated water carried cholera at a time when miasmatic explanations remained influential. His 1855 edition of On the Mode of Communication of Cholera lays out the case. 60. The famous pump handle has become a symbol because it captures a moral virtue that rarely receives a feast day. Follow the causal trail even when received wisdom points elsewhere. A child dying of cholera does not care whether the prevailing theory is ancient, respectable, unanimous, or endorsed by impressive men. The bacterium is unmoved by authority. Reality is scandalously Protestant about some questions. It insists on checking for itself. Semmelweis. Wash your hands, offend the profession. Ignaz Semmelweis observed catastrophic puerperal fever mortality and found that hand cleansing dramatically reduced deaths in the maternity wards he studied. His later book assembled the argument. 62. He met resistance, professional hostility, and tragedy. Here is a useful parable for Saint Counting. A majority of respectable people can possess status, training, moral seriousness, and a shared error. The mothers still die. The dead do not become statistically less dead because the consensus had credentials. Wash the hands, check the mortality, let reality humiliate the vote. Joseph Lister. Mercy learns antisepsis. Joseph Lister's antiseptic work helped transform surgery by applying germ theory insights to the problem of infection. His 1867 Lancet paper made the case for antiseptic practice. 61. Again, the moral achievement is inseparable from causal understanding. Compassion without knowledge may sit faithfully beside the patient while infection wins. Knowledge without compassion may become clever cruelty. Put the two together, and a surgeon changes practice because fewer patients ought to rot from an operation meant to help them. There is no mystery in calling that good. Jonas Salk, the child outside the iron lung. Poliomyelitis supplied 20th century families with terror requiring no theologian to make it vivid. Jonas Salk and his collaborators developed the inactivated polio vaccine. Mass vaccination began in the United States in 1955, and polio incidents fell dramatically in the years that followed. WHO and CDC histories document the transformation. 24-25. The achievement was collective. Manufacturing failures mattered. The Cutter incident caused vaccine-associated cases and deaths, leading to stronger controls. 26. That belongs in the story. Scientific hero worship would hide the incident. Scientific morality should remember it. No one needs Salk to be infallible. No one has to ask Salk for intercession. No council needs to define Salkism. The evidential residue is brutally plain. Children who otherwise would have been paralyzed were not paralyzed. A vaccine leaves its theology in the nervous system. Morris Hilleman. Millions helped by a man they never praised. Maurice Hilleman's name is less famous than the diseases his vaccine work helped prevent. Medical histories credit him with leadership or major contributions across vaccines for measles, mumps, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, varicella, meningococcal disease, and more. 27-28. There is something wonderfully disrespectful toward fame in this kind of goodness. Millions benefit from a person they never invoke. No shrines are necessary. Children reach adulthood without knowing whose laboratory work altered the odds. If moral greatness requires applause, Hilleman is inconvenient. If it includes making strangers less likely to bury their children, his case becomes rather stronger. Fleming, Florey, Chain, Heatley. The antibiotic is not a relic. Alexander Fleming's 1929 paper on penicillium became one step in the development of penicillin. The later clinical transformation depended crucially on Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, Norman Heatley, and others who turned observation into a workable therapeutic program. 63. The collective story matters because medicine does not need solitary saints. It needs discoverers, chemists, technicians, manufacturers, clinicians, trial participants, regulators, nurses, and systems capable of correcting failure. A bacterial infection does not ask whether its rescuer had heroic virtue. It asks, in the only language bacteria understand, whether the drug works. 2UU. Tradition submits to the patient. 2UU's work on artemisinin gives us a useful picture of how to respect tradition without worshiping it. Traditional Chinese medical literature supplied clues. Extraction methods, testing, chemistry, clinical work, and evidence determined what survived. Nobel materials document artemisinin's extraordinary importance in malaria treatment. 29-30. An old text offered a lead. The parasite got the final vote. This is how inherited wisdom earns authority. It walks into the laboratory, removes its crown, and permits reality to disagree. Imagine importing that habit into theology. William Foge, Mercy as Logistics. William Foge's role in smallpox eradication shows compassion becoming logistics. Surveillance and containment strategies, vaccination, field intelligence, governments, WHO teams, local workers, and communities helped break transmission chains. 31-32. Smallpox eradication is morally beautiful in a peculiar way. Its beneficiaries often do not know they were beneficiaries. The child who never develops smallpox has no scar, no memory, no story of rescue. She simply gets a childhood. If one insists upon counting holy works, every broken chain of transmission deserves an entry. Francis Oldham Kelsey, The Holiness of Saying No. Francis Oldham Kelsey, reviewing thalidomide for the US FDA, resisted pressure because the safety evidence was inadequate. The National Library of Medicine records the episode. The United States largely avoided the scale of thalidomide catastrophe seen elsewhere. 33. There was no ecstasy, no apparition, no incorrupt body. A civil servant read an application and said the evidence was insufficient. Civilization sometimes depends upon sentences too boring for hagiography. The data are inadequate. Come back with better evidence. Do not experiment on the public because the manufacturer is impatient. That is a form of moral seriousness I wish were contagious. Norman Borlaug and the Scandal of Feeding People. Norman Borlaug's breeding work on high-yield, disease-resistant wheat became a major part of the Green Revolution. The history contains legitimate controversies about agricultural systems, inputs, distribution, ecology, and politics. 64. Keep the controversies, then keep the other fact. Agricultural science helped avert feared food shortages and increased food production for vast populations. A hungry person is not a philosophical abstraction. Calories are vulgar, so is starvation. A moral culture that can debate the metaphysics of desert for 500 pages should be able to spare a paragraph for the obscene goodness of making famine less likely. Pleasure also counts. Civilization after the fever breaks. There is another defect in the ledger as I have stated it so far. It is too gloomy. A decent civilization does not merely reduce screams. It produces laughter. It does not merely lower the fever. It gives the recovered patient something to do on Saturday night. It does not merely prevent paralysis. It gives the child a basketball, a song, a film, a ridiculous puzzle game, a park, a dance, a friend, a dog, a joke, and enough leisure to enjoy any of them. Pain matters. So does pleasure. Misery matters. So does delight. Loneliness matters. So do friendship, play, beauty, amusement, curiosity, comfort, erotic love, family affection, music in headphones, a good meal, an afternoon game, a stupid comedy that makes a miserable week briefly tolerable, and the blessed miracle of somebody else doing the errand when you are exhausted. A moral arithmetic that counts only lives saved and diseases prevented is still incomplete. Human welfare has a positive column, and that positive column creates a fresh embarrassment for saint counting. A person may retreat from ordinary life, renounce property, eat badly, sleep on boards, speak little, pray for 10 hours a day, and acquire an impressive reputation for holiness. None of those facts by themselves tell me how much happiness that person produced for anybody. Poverty is not a virtue merely because it is voluntary. Dirt is not holiness. Discomfort is not goodness. A bare room is not a moral argument. Hunger does not become admirable when selected from a menu of ascetic options. If voluntary poverty frees someone to nurse the sick, teach children, protect animals, feed strangers, or resist oppression, Then praise the nursing, teaching, protection, feeding, and resistance. Praise the consequence and the character that produced it. But do not hand moral points to the empty cupboard. A man can own nothing and still be useless. Another can own a piano and give joy to millions. Now the vulgar standard becomes positively indecent. Ask not only, whose suffering did you reduce? Ask also, whose life did you make better? Music, the useless luxury without which life becomes poorer. Consider Duke Ellington. No vaccine bears his name. No epidemic curve bends because of a jazz arrangement. He did something else. Over a career of more than half a century, he composed an enormous body of music and helped shape one of the great musical languages of modern life. Smithsonian sources describe him as a musical pioneer, with more than 1,000 arrangements and compositions. 70. What is the moral value of that? If one has trained oneself to think goodness means only renunciation, the answer may be embarrassingly small. If one thinks conscious experience matters, the answer is obvious enough to anybody who has ever needed music. Music turns solitude into company. It gives grief a form. It gives celebration a sound. It lets strangers move together without first agreeing on metaphysics. It fills weddings, funerals, kitchens, buses, bedrooms, clubs, headphones, stadiums, and the long drive home. Louis Armstrong altered jazz as a performer, composer, and improviser. The Library of Congress describes him as one of the great creative figures of the music and an innovative singer whose work helped transform the form. 71. Stevie Wonder spent decades writing and performing music that became part of ordinary emotional life across generations. 72. You may prefer Bach. You may prefer Lata Mangeshkar, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, Aretha Franklin, A.R. Rahman, Prince, Beethoven, Ella Fitzgerald, or somebody recording shoegaze in a basement with 47 monthly listeners. The philosophical point does not depend on the playlist. People who create music create episodes of pleasure, consolation, excitement, memory, communal identity, and play. These are not decorative scraps left over after real morality has been counted. They are among the things for which preventing death is valuable in the first place. What a peculiar moral philosophy it would be that congratulated a hermit for sleeping on stone, but had no category for the person who gave 10 million strangers 4 minutes of joy. Cinema, 2 hours in the dark, can improve a life. Charlie Chaplin did not abolish cholera. He made enormous numbers of people laugh, often across linguistic borders. The National Endowment for the Humanities records Martin Scorsese calling Chaplin truly universal, precisely because silent cinema crossed language so easily. 73. Hayao Miyazaki likewise built worlds that generations of children and adults have inhabited for pleasure, wonder, fear, tenderness, and imagination. The Academy describes him as one of Japan's most distinctive filmmakers and notes the international stature of the studio he co-founded. 74. No, watching My Neighbor Totoro is not morally equivalent to being vaccinated against polio. This is not a competition in which every good must be forced into one stupid unit before it is allowed to exist. The point is simpler. Pleasure is good. Imagination is good. Shared stories are good. A child who laughs for 90 minutes has experienced something worth producing. An adult whose depression of spirit is interrupted by comedy has received something real. A family that watches a beloved film together has not wasted moral space because nobody was bleeding. A monastery may produce contemplation. Wonderful. A cinema may produce delight. Wonderful. The absurdity begins when one of these is treated as presumptively holy and the other as mere entertainment, as though joy required an apology before entering the moral accounts. Games. Civilization occasionally has the good sense to play. James Naismith invented basketball in 1891. William G. Morgan invented volleyball in 1895. Morgan explicitly wanted a game less vigorous than basketball for older YMCA members. These inventions became global forms of play, exercise, competition, friendship, spectatorship, and communal ritual. 75, 76. Think for a moment about the amount of ordinary happiness contained in that sentence. Schoolyards, pickup games, amateur leagues, parents embarrassing children from bleachers, friends shouting at televisions, people who met because a ball had to go through a hoop or over a net. No apparition was required. Two people devised games. Alfred Mosher Butz designed the game that became Scrabble. Alexei Pajitnov created Tetris in 1984. 77, 78. Shigeru Miyamoto helped create Mario and The Legend of Zelda, and became one of the defining designers of an entire medium. Nintendo's own historical interviews document his central creative role, while the broader industry treats those works as landmarks of game design. 79. How many evenings of harmless pleasure came from falling blocks? How many friendships have formed around controllers? How many children learned cooperation from games, competition from games, spatial reasoning from games, storytelling from games, or simply discovered that an otherwise miserable afternoon could become fun? The theologian may sniff that these are temporal goods. Certainly. We are temporal creatures. That is where most of our Tuesdays happen. If an eternal perspective makes the happiness of embodied creatures look contemptibly small, perhaps the defect lies less in the happiness than in the perspective. The people who make ordinary life less exhausting. And now let us descend even farther from the marble pedestal, because moral vanity hates nothing so much as useful work without glamour. Consider the caregiver who bathes an elderly stranger, the home care worker who changes sheets, the disability support worker who helps someone shop, the child care worker who gives a parent 3 hours in which to work or sleep, the cleaner who restores a filthy apartment, the delivery driver who carries groceries to somebody with limited mobility, the neighbor who walks the dog, the friend who drives another friend to an appointment, the person who fills out a form for somebody who cannot understand it. These acts are not metaphysically glamorous. They do not produce relics. Nobody paints a gold circle around the head of the woman who changes an incontinent patient at 3 in the morning. Yet ask the patient which service has more immediate moral content. Another treatise explaining why suffering can fit divine justice, or somebody arriving with clean clothes and breakfast. The entire economy of care is full of people whose goodness is expressed in repetitions so boring that hagiography hardly knows what to do with them. Lift, wash, cook, drive, listen, carry, remind, clean, sit beside, come back tomorrow. There is your litany. Jane Addams, Janie Porter Barrett, and the holiness of practical social work. Jane Addams and her colleagues at Hull House did not merely admire poverty from a safe theological distance. Hull House offered education, social services, childcare, cultural programs, and practical assistance to working-class immigrants and laborers. The National Park Service describes it as a place intended to help immigrants not merely settle, but thrive. 80, 81. Janie Porter Barrett created the Locust Street Settlement House in Virginia, providing classes, childcare, entertainment, and lectures to the black community around her. She later helped establish an institution serving black girls caught in the penal system. 82. Again, do not canonize them. That would miss the argument so thoroughly one might suspect deliberate effort. Inspect the work. Childcare happened. Education happened. People acquired help in the same world in which their rent was due. Community happened. Somebody's burden became lighter because another human being organized time, money, rooms, labor, and attention around making it lighter. If one wishes to call that less spiritually impressive than owning no shoes, one is welcome to explain the metric. Animal welfare, compassion that notices the creature in front of it. Then there are the people who refuse the ancient convenience of treating non-human suffering as morally cheap. Henry Bergh founded the ASPCA in New York in 1866 and pushed for stronger anti-cruelty law. The organization's history records his campaigns against abuse of working horses and his efforts to secure legal protection for animals. 83. Ruth Harrison's 1964 Animal Machines helped force intensive farm animal suffering into public view. Scholarship on European animal welfare reform describes the book as having enormous international impact. 84. This kind of work has a wonderfully vulgar feature. The animal does not need to understand the activist's metaphysics in order to benefit. The horse merely needs the beating to stop. A dog does not care whether its rescuer has achieved mystical union. A hen does not ask whether the reformer possesses sanctifying grace. A frightened animal has an admirably unsophisticated theology. Less terror, less pain, food, water, room to move, and perhaps a gentle hand. That standard is beneath certain philosophical systems only because it is beneath nothing with a nervous system. The positive ledger. So enlarge the vulgar ledger. Put beside the epidemiologist the musician, beside the surgeon the comedian, beside the vaccine developer the game designer, beside the famine fighter the social worker, beside the regulator the caregiver, beside the animal welfare reformer the shelter worker who spends an afternoon coaxing one terrified dog out from under a table. Then add the millions whose names will never enter an encyclopedia. Teachers, cooks, cleaners, translators, librarians, bus drivers, child care workers, disability aides, recreation workers, artists, coaches, gardeners, stagehands, sound engineers, game programmers, animal rescuers, community organizers, and the relative who spends 6 years caring for a parent with dementia. The point is not that every useful person is a saint. The point is that saint was never the unit we needed. The unit was always the sentient life made better. And here the romance of asceticism deserves one last rude question. Suppose one man gives away his possessions, withdraws from ordinary society, eats little, sleeps badly, spends decades in prayer, and dies celebrated for his detachment. Suppose another woman lives comfortably, loves music, owns a television, enjoys dessert, works 40 years in disability support, helps hundreds of people bathe, eat, travel, laugh, shop, celebrate birthdays, and remain connected to their families. Which life contained more moral value? Do not answer with the wardrobe. Do not answer with the bank balance. Do not answer with how much pleasure each person successfully denied himself. Tell me what happened to conscious creatures because they lived. That is the vulgar standard. It has no incense. It has the indecency to ask for results. The moral difference between explaining pain and ending it. Now place the ledgers side by side. Augustine, punishment without end, 8. Chrysostom, eternal life, eternal punishment, 42. Aquinas, the blessed lose pity for the damned and behold their suffering within the order of beatitude. 11. Catherine's dialogue, the blessed parent can see a damned child and remain content with justice. 46. Francis de Sales, meditate upon the eternity of hell. 55. Leonard, contemplate the fewness of the saved. 57. Faustina, hell enters devotional vision, 56. Now the other ledger. Nightingale counts preventable deaths, 22, 23. Snow traces cholera to water, 60. Semmelweis washes the hands, 62. Lister fights surgical infection, 61. Salk attacks paralysis, 24, 25. Hilleman prevents disease at population scale, 27, 28. 2 turns an old clue into a malaria treatment, 29, 30. Fauci helps hunt smallpox transmission until the virus loses its human refuge, 31, 32. Kelsey refuses to gamble with pregnant patients, 33. One body of work explains why certain suffering can be eternally deserved. The other keeps making suffering harder to find. This is where the moral comparison reaches the gut. The theologian may insist that the first ledger concerns eternal goods, and the second merely temporal welfare. The patient, in his vulgarity, still prefers the fever to end. The mother, lacking metaphysical refinement, still prefers the child not to be paralyzed. The damned creature, were there one before us, would presumably prefer the eternal fire to stop. It takes an impressive amount of theory to explain why the first two preferences deserve our compassion, while the third must be purified out of us. The last account. But eternal goods are higher. The strongest traditional reply is obvious. Bodily health is finite. Eternal destiny is infinite. Saving a life preserves a temporary good. Saving a soul concerns an eternal good. Once the hierarchy is granted, the nurse and the saint occupy different offices. Granted. Now notice the smuggling compartment. The hierarchy is the disputed premise. One cannot put infinite on one side of the scale, declare every creaturely welfare finite, and then congratulate the scale for discovering what was typed into it. An infinity symbol is a marvelous laundering machine. Feed it agony, and it returns proportionate justice. Feed it a parent's horror at a child in hell, and it returns imperfect conformity to divine justice. Feed it 1,000,000 years of suffering, and it asks whether you remembered the dignity of the offended party. The mathematics is doing no moral work. The valuation was installed before the symbol arrived. Anselm's infinitely weighty divine offense illustrates the move beautifully. Once the smallest offense against God may outweigh worlds, the welfare of worlds no longer has a chance to influence the verdict. The conclusion has been hidden in the exchange rate. But the saints were holier than us. Perhaps the saints saw more clearly because they were holier. Which part of holiness performs the relevant epistemic miracle? Prayer, rival traditions pray, asceticism? Jains have made Catholic asceticism look positively recreational. Charity? Buddhists, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, atheists, humanists, and ordinary grandmothers have managed charity. Courage? Every civilization has martyrs for propositions incompatible with Catholicism. Mystical experience? Competing religions have libraries full of it. Moral transformation? Again, rival traditions produce transformed lives. If holiness means conformity to Catholic doctrine, the argument is circular. If holiness means independently recognizable virtues such as compassion, courage, generosity, patience, and self-control, the rival holy people qualify, and their contrary moral intuitions return to the room. There is no magic third option produced by saying saint more reverently. But our moral intuitions are corrupted. Of course, moral intuitions can be corrupted. That observation is true and almost useless until someone tells us which intuitions are corrupted and how we know. The infernalist says our horror at everlasting punishment may be corrupted by sentimentality, secular culture, softness, pride, or failure to understand divine holiness. Fine. The universalist can reverse the accusation. Perhaps the ability to contemplate endless agony without moral revolt is the corrupted state. Perhaps centuries of threat, inherited doctrine, divine command reasoning, and penal imagination trained decent people to call cruelty justice. Both accusations are available. The saint count cannot decide between them because the saint count is part of the causal story being disputed. Augustine's phrase, "greater tenderness of spirit," becomes especially revealing here. 8. The tender impulse is visible. Infernalism teaches Augustine to distrust where it leads. Why should I assume the distrust marks moral purification rather than moral damage? Ethan points to the number of saints who performed the same distrust. I point to the institution that taught them the same lesson. We have arrived where we started. The animal case exposes the method. Ethan's appeal to the common practice of the saints in discussing animal suffering is useful because the stakes are ordinary and visible. 37. Here we do not need to imagine post-mortem fire. We can look at the animal. We can observe pain behavior, stress, injury, confinement, fear, slaughter, and the structure of the practice. Then the appeal arrives. Saints commonly ate meat. Animal welfare interests may be morally slight by comparison with human goods. Now invite Mahavira's heirs into the room. Invite Buddhist compassion. Invite Valalar. 15, 16, 17, 21, 50. Suddenly, holy practice points in opposite directions. Which saints get to define moral normality? If Catholic saints receive privileged voting rights because Catholicism is true, the saint counting has again become decorative. The real argument is Catholicism's truth. If holy practice itself is the evidence, Jain and Buddhist traditions are evidence too. And on animal concern, they may embarrass the Catholic sample rather badly. This is why sectarian saint counting is a rigged election disguised as moral epistemology. What the majority actually establishes. The Catholic majority establishes several things worth knowing. It tells us infernalism was historically powerful. It tells us brilliant and compassionate people can learn to accept it. It tells us theological systems can reach deeply into moral emotion. It tells us human beings can regard themselves as deserving horrors they would hesitate to inflict upon an enemy. It tells us institutions can reproduce moral judgments with extraordinary stability across centuries. Those are substantial conclusions. The majority does not by itself establish that eternal torment is just. To get there, Ethan needs the bridge he keeps trying to replace with a procession. He needs a reason why these saints were especially reliable about this proposition. He needs a reason their judgments carry weight beyond the common formation that explains their convergence. He needs an account of why Gregory, Macrina, Isaac, Ksitigarbha, Shantideva, Ramanuja's hagiographic ideal, Jain ahimsa, Sikh service, and the raw moral intuition against endless agony are all inferior witnesses. He needs to explain why compassion becomes trustworthy when Damien enters a leper colony and untrustworthy when compassion objects to an occupied hell. That is the argument. The head count was merely the entrance music. Bring the abacus. So, Ethan, bring the abacus, Count Justin and his everlasting fire. 41:53. Count Cyril and eternal punishment. 54. Count Athanasius and eternal fire. 44. Count Chrysostom, eternal life, eternal punishment. 42. Count Jerome and the fire that burns for punishment. 43. Count Augustine, who names the opposing impulse greater tenderness and still keeps punishment without end. 8. Count Gregory the Great and the eternal penalties. 45:51. Count Aquinas, whose blessed do not pity the damned and behold their sufferings within beatitude. 11. Count Catherine's blessed parent, looking upon a damned child without being troubled. 46. Count Teresa, learning to regard herself as deserving hell. 47. Count Francis de Sales, meditating on its eternity. 55. Count Alphonsus, describing himself as having merited it. 48. Count Leonard, preaching the fewness of the saved. 57. Count Faustina's infernal vision. 56. Count Padre Pio, if you like. Count every traditional saint you can establish cleanly. I will even hold the clipboard. The majority is yours. Now count Gregory of Nyssa and restorative purification. 3, 38, 39. Count Macrina and the restoration of all things. 40. Count Isaac of Nineveh, now in the Roman martyrology, defending universal salvation. 4, 5, 6. They are a minority. A minority does not have to win the election to prove that sainthood itself never guaranteed the infernalist result. Then leave Rome's jurisdiction and continue counting. Count Mahavira's legacy of radical non-harm. 15-16-50. Count the Buddha's loving kindness stretching across living beings. 17. Count Shantideva wishing to become medicine, nurse, food, and drink. 18. 19. Count Ksitigarbha refusing final Buddhahood while hell still has occupants. 49. Count Ramanuja's remembered willingness to risk his own damnation if others might be saved. 58. Count Guru Nanak's legacy of langar. 20. Count Bhai Kanhaya giving water across enemy lines. 59. Count Valalar making compassion toward living beings and feeding the hungry a sacred obligation. 21. Now tell me which collection owns moral perception by divine franchise. And when the saints, bodhisattvas, gurus, tirthankaras, mystics, theologians, monks, and sages have finished contradicting one another, open the ledger that does not care what religion anybody had. Count the deaths Nightingale helped make visible. 22-23. Count the cholera cases Snow helped explain. 60. Count the mothers whose odds improved when hand hygiene stopped being an insult to professional dignity. 62. Count the surgical infections antisepsis helped prevent. 61. Count the children who never entered an iron lung because polio vaccination existed. 24-25. Count the infections Hilliman's vaccines helped prevent. 27-28. Count the bacterial deaths transformed by antibiotics. 63. Count the malaria cases treated with artemisinin. 29-30. Count the smallpox transmission chains hunted down until there were none left in nature. 31-32. Count the thalidomide disaster the United States largely escaped because Francis Kelsey demanded evidence instead of reverence. 33. Count the harvests that made famine less likely. 64. Those achievements have a vulgar habit theology sometimes finds inconvenient. The sufferer can tell the difference. A child spared paralysis need not understand immunology to enjoy the leg that still moves. A mother who does not die of puerperal fever need not know Semmelweis's biography. A smallpox virus does not care whether William Fogey had heroic virtue. A malaria parasite does not defer to a doctor of the church. Reality has terrible manners around prestige. It keeps asking what happened. That is the question I want beside every claim of superior moral perception. What happened to compassion inside the theory? Did it widen? Did it become more exact? Did it notice victims previously ignored? Did it become action? Did it reduce suffering? Or did it learn a vocabulary in which endless suffering ceased to be morally embarrassing? Augustine saw the tenderness and overruled it. Aquinas systematized a heaven without pity for the lost. Catherine could imagine parental contentment before a damned child. Ksitigarbha will not leave hell occupied. Shantideva wants to become medicine. Ramanuja's hagiographic hero would risk hell rather than hoard salvation. Nightingale counts the dead. Salk prevents the paralysis. Kelsey stops the drug. The moral contrast is not subtle enough to require incense. You want to count saints, Ethan? Count them. Then count the suffering they learned to justify. Then count the suffering other people actually stopped. A man may win a census and lose a syllogism. Churches have been accomplishing the first feat for centuries. Sources and research notes. Primary texts, institutional sources, academic reference works, and standard historical sources. The core web links below were already retained in the prior researched draft. The additional book/article references are bibliographic citations. Historical hagiography is identified as hagiography where used. The Uncertainty Podcast/iHeart, a heated debate on hell, Catholicism, and fine-tuning, Ethan Muse, July 3, 2026. including the chapter Saints, Sin, and Moral Authority. Open source. 2. Bentham's Bulldog, Do We Deserve Infinite Suffering? July 5, 2026, summarizing Muse's appeal to Padre Pio and Alphonsus Liguori as a defeater for contrary moral intuitions about hell. Open source. 3. Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Gregory of Nyssa, Discussion of Remedial Punishment and Universal Salvation. Open source. 4. Vatican Press Office, Inclusion of Isaac of Nineveh in the Roman Martyrology, November 9, 2024. Open source. 5. Pope Francis, Address to Mar Awa III, November 9, 2024, announcing Isaac's addition to the Roman Martyrology. Open source. 6. Matthew Fairhurst, Isaac of Nineveh's Doctrine of Universal Salvation, Ph.D. thesis, University of Cambridge Repository, 2026. Open source. 7. Tertullian, De Spectaculis, Chapter 30, New Advent Translation. Open source. 8. Augustine, City of God, Book 21, Chapters 23 to 24, New Advent Translation. Open source. 9. Anselm, Cur Deus Homo, Book 1, Chapter 21, Boston University-hosted public text. Open source. 10. New Advent editorial note on the Summa Theologiae supplement and its compilation from Aquinas' commentary on the fourth book of the Sentences. Open source. 11. Thomas Aquinas, Derived Supplement, Summa Theologiae, Question 94, The Relations of the Saints Towards the Damned. Open source. 12. Vatican Biography, St. Joseph Damian de Veuster, 1840 to 1889. Open source. 13. Pope Francis, Message to the Vincentian Family, September 27, 2017, on Vincent de Paul and the Confraternities of Charity. Open source. 14. Pope Francis, Address to the Camillians, May 16, 2022, on St. Camillus de Lellis and Care for the Suffering. Open source. 15. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Jaina Philosophy, on Nonviolence, Non-Absolutism, and Non-Attachment. Open source. 16. Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Jain Philosophy, on Ahimsa and the Five Vows. Open source. 17. Sutta Central, Metta Sutta, SNP 1.8, Bhikkhu Sujato Translation. Open source. 18. Shanti Deva Bodhicaryavatara, Chapter 1, Lotsawa House Translation. Open source. 19. Shanti Deva Bodhicaryavatara, Chapter 3, Lotsawa House Translation. Open source. 20. Parliament of the World's Religions, Guru Ka Langar, The Sikh Ethos of Sharing Hospitality, 2019. Open source. 21. Valalar.org, Dharma Salai, Food for Hunger, on Jiva Karunyam, Feeding the Hungry and Non-Killing. Open source. 22. Fee and Garofalo, Florence Nightingale and the Crimean War, American Journal of Public Health / PubMed Central, 2010. Open source. 23. Bradshaw, Florence Nightingale, 1820 to 1910. An Unexpected Master of Data, PubMed Central, 2020. Open source. 24. World Health Organization, History of Polio Vaccination, open source. 25. CDC Pink Book, Chapter 18, Poliomyelitis, open source. 26. CDC Museum, Polio and the Epidemic Intelligence Service, including the Cutter incident and subsequent controls, open source. 27. Newman, Morris Hilleman, PubMed Central, 2005, open source. 28. Tulchinsky, Maurice Hilleman, Creator of Vaccines That Changed the World, PubMed Central, 2018, open source. 29. Nobel Prize to UU, Biographical Material, open source. 30. Nobel Prize 2015, Advanced Information on Artemisinin and Malaria Treatment. Open source. 31. CDC Emerging Infectious Diseases, Etymologia, Ring Vaccination, 2024, on Foigi and colleagues' surveillance and containment work in Nigeria. Open source. 32. FOGE, Smallpox Eradication in West and Central Africa Revisited, WHO Bulletin Historical Paper, open source. 33. U.S. National Library of Medicine, Dr. Frances Kathleen Oldham Kelsey, on thalidomide review and drug safety, open source. 34. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Disagreement on Epistemic Peers, Testimonial Weight, and Independence, open source. 35. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Jury Theorems on Majority Reliability, Competence, Dependence, and Common Causes of Votes, open source. 36. United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, Saints, describing canonization as a canonical process investigating heroic virtue, faith, hope, and love, open source. 37. Ethan Muse, Public Substack Comment, October 15, 2025, appealing to the common practice of the saints in a discussion of animal welfare and meat consumption, open source. 38. Gregory of Nyssa, The Great Catechism, Part 3, on purifying fire and nature restored pure to God, New Advent, open source. 39. Gregory of Nyssa, on the soul and the resurrection, on the removal of evil and postmortem purification, New Advent, open source. 40. Catholic Encyclopedia, Saint Macrina the Younger, describing Gregory's dialogue with Macrina as treating the restoration of all things, open source. 41. Justin Martyr, First Apology, on the unrepentant being punished in everlasting fire, New Advent, open source. 42. John Chrysostom, Homily 25 on Romans, If the life be eternal, the punishment is eternal, New Advent, open source. 43. Jerome, Letter 39, on Gehenna, and punishment for which the eternal fire burns, New Advent, open source. 44. United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, The Hope of Eternal Life, citing Athanasius on those who have done evil entering eternal fire, open source. 45. Gregory the Great, Pastoral Rule, Book 3, on liability to eternal punishment and grievous torments, New Advent, open source. 46. Catherine of Siena, Dialogue, on blessed parents seeing a child in hell and being content with the punishment, Christian Classics Ethereal Library, open source. 47. Teresa of Avila, Life, Chapter 32, on the place she believed she deserved in hell and its torments, Christian Classics Ethereal Library, open source. 48. Alphonsus Liguori, Uniformity with God's Will, on having merited hell for sins and being spared in eternity, Christian Classics Ethereal Library, open source. 49. Dharma Drum Mountain, The Foundation of Attaining Buddhahood, Altruism, on Ksitigarbha's vow not to attain Buddhahood until the hells are emptied, open source. 50. Stanford MAHB, Ahimsa, Nonviolence, The Life Force of Jainism, on animals, plants, and humans as living souls deserving respect and compassion, open source. 51. Gregory the Great, Moralia in Job, Book 34, Defending Punishment Without End and Describing the Just Beholding the Eternal Punishments They Escaped, open source. 52. The Uncertainty Podcast / Miles Donahue, Everything Wrong with the Case for Eternal Hell, Randall Rouser, August 6, 2026. Chapter, Should We Trust the Moral Judgment of Catholic Saints? Open source. 53. Justin Martyr, Second Apology, on Sinners Justly Suffering in Eternal Fire, New Advent, open source. 54. Cyril of Jerusalem, Catechetical Lecture, 18, NPNF, Series 2, Volume 7, on the resurrection of the wicked to a body enduring eternal punishment. 55. Francis de Sales, Introduction to the Devout Life, Part 1, The Meditation on Hell, on the Eternity of the Pains of the Lost. 56. Faustina Kowalska. Diary, Divine Mercy in My Soul, Section 741, reporting a vision of hell and everlasting suffering. Cited here as evidence of devotional infernalism, not as public dogmatic proof. 57. Leonard of Port Maurice, The Little Number of Those Who Are Saved, traditional published sermon defending the fewness of the saved and the reality of eternal loss. 58. A. Govindacharya, The Life of Ramanujacharya, Madras, 1906. Traditional hagiographical account of Ramanuja publicly sharing the saving mantra, despite being warned that doing so would bring damnation upon himself. 59. Harbans Singh, editor, The Encyclopedia of Sikhism, entry on Bhai Kanhaiya, standard Sikh tradition concerning his service of water to wounded soldiers without regard to side. 60. John Snow, On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, 2nd edition, London, 1855, including the Broad Street outbreak investigation. 61. Joseph Lister, On the Antiseptic Principle in the Practice of Surgery, The Lancet, 1867. 62. Ignaz Semmelweis, The Etiology, Concept, and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, 1861. On Hand Cleansing and Puerperal Fever. 63. Alexander Fleming, On the Antibacterial Action of Cultures of a Penicillium, British Journal of Experimental Pathology, 1929. For the later clinical development of penicillin, see the work of Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, Norman Heatley, and collaborators. 64. Norman E. Borlaug, Nobel Peace Prize Materials, 1970, and Historical Literature on the Green Revolution, cited for high-yield wheat and famine prevention while acknowledging broader debates about agricultural systems. 65. Shantideva, Bodhikariyavatara, Chapter 10, verse 55, in the standard English translation reproduced by Tibet House, Japan. For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then, may I too abide, to dispel the misery of the world. Open source. 66. Study Buddhism, Instructions for This Lifetime, Avalokiteshvara Deity Practice, explaining shepherd-like bodhicitta as bringing everybody else to Buddhahood first and attaining it oneself afterward. Open source. 67. FPMT/Mandala, Bodhicitta, The Perfection of Dharma. Traditional account of Avalokiteshvara's shepherd-like vow, he will not realize enlightenment until he has first led all mother sentient beings there. Open source. 68. Patrul Rinpoche, The Brightly Shining Sun, Lotsawa House. As long as any sentient being /anywhere has not been liberated may I remain for the sake of that being even if I have attained unsurpassed enlightenment. Open source. 69. Atisha, Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, verses 26 to 30, Lotsawa House, prescribing the Bodhisattva vow to liberate all beings and to remain until the very end for the sake of even a single being. Open source. 70. Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, Jazz Appreciation Month, Duke Ellington, describing Ellington as a musical pioneer who composed more than 1,000 arrangements. https://mahc.si.edu/explore/stories/jazz-month-duke-ellington. 71. Library of Congress, Jazz Singers Online Exhibition on Louis Armstrong's creative and innovative role in jazz and scat singing. https://www.loc.gov/exhibits/jazz-singers/online-exhibition.html. 72. Kennedy Center, Stevie Wonder, biographical profile of the singer-songwriter and his decades-long musical career. https://www.kennedy-center.org/artists/w/wo-wz/Stevie-Wonder/ 73 National Endowment for the Humanities, The Art of Martin Scorsese, discussion of Charlie Chaplin's unusually universal reach through silent cinema. https://www.neh.gov/humanities/2013/July-August/conversation/the-art-Martin-Scorsese. 74. Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, Hayao Miyazaki, on Miyazaki's filmmaking career and the international stature of Studio Ghibli. https://www.oscars.org/collection-highlights/Hayao-Miyazaki. 75. Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame/Springfield College History Materials. James Naismith created basketball in 1891. See also Volleyball Hall of Fame Historical Summary. https://www.volleyball.org/basketball-and-volleyball.html. 76. International Volleyball Federation, FIVB, History, identifying William G. Morgan as the inventor of volleyball in 1895. https://www.fivb.com/volleyball/the-game/history/. 77. Lemelson MIT Program, Alfred Butts, on the development and early production of Scrabble. https://lemelson.mit.edu/resources/Alfred-Butts. 78. The Tetris Company, Corporate Bios, and About Tetris, identifying Alexei Pajitnov as the creator of Tetris in 1984. https://tetris.com/corporate-bios. https://tetris.com/about. 79. Nintendo, Iwata Asks Archive, interviews documenting Shigeru Miyamoto's central creative role in the Mario and Zelda series and Nintendo game design. https://iwataasks.nintendo.com/. 80. U.S. National Park Service, Jane Addams, on Addams's founding of Hull House and its work helping immigrants settle and thrive. https://www.nps.gov/people/jane-addams.htm. 81. Virginia Commonwealth University Social Welfare History Project, Jane Addams and Hull House, on social services, education, kindergarten, and community programs. https://socialwelfare.library.vcu.edu/settlement-houses/Adams-Jane/ https://socialwelfare.library.vcu.edu/settlement-houses/Hull-house/. 82. U.S. National Park Service, Janie Porter Barrett, on the Locust Street Settlement House, childcare, classes, entertainment, lectures, and Barrett's later work for black girls. https://www.nps.gov/people/Janie-Porter-Barrett.htm. 83. ASPCA, History of the ASPCA, on Henry Berg's 1866 founding of the organization, anti-cruelty advocacy, and protection of working animals. https://www.asp.ca.org/about-us/history-of-the-ASPCA. 84. MC Appleby, The EU Ban on Battery Cages, History and Prospects, discussing the international impact of Ruth Harrison's animal machines on farm animal welfare reform. Animal Studies Repository, 2003. https://animalstudiesrepository.org/cgi/viewcontent.cgi?article equals 1008 ampersand context equals SOTA_2003. Citation boundary note. Tertullian is discussed as an influential early Christian infernalist, not counted as a canonized Catholic saint. Anselm is used for the moral arithmetic of divine offense, not as an extra ballot in the canonized saint total. The Aquinas passage is identified as material in the posthumous supplement derived from his earlier sentences commentary. Macrina's restorationist teaching is accessed through Gregory of Nysa's dialogue and the Catholic Encyclopedia's summary of that work. The Ramanuja episode is explicitly treated as traditional hagiography. The argument concerns the moral ideal the tradition celebrates, not modern historical verification of every narrative detail. Private revelations, such as Faustina's, are used as evidence of devotional infernalist imagination, not as independent dogmatic demonstrations. Strict criterion note. Ksitigarbha, the shepherd-like Avalokiteshvara tradition, Santideva, and the Patrul/Atisha material are used for the explicit others first/I remain motif. Ramanuja is a related but different case. Willingness to risk damnation so that others may be saved, not a vow to postpone liberation until every sentient being is liberated. Jain and Sikh examples are used for wider compassion and service, not for this specific postponement claim.